It's normal for a man to want a young and fresh body. My husband Mark laughed arrogantly, leaning back on the leather sofa in our spacious living room in the Hamptons, where we had lived together for 12 years. You're already, as they say, a bit past your prime, Martha. Accept it, don't pollute the air, and don't put on these cheap provincial scenes for me. Well now, darling, you don't have to hide your close relationship with my niece Chloe anymore. I gave a quiet snort, feeling everything inside me harden and turn to ice, and carefully placed a thick blue folder with the prepared divorce papers onto the polished surface of the coffee table. Oh, stop with these silly hysterics, Martha. You're not suited to the role of a wounded innocent. You understand perfectly well how this world works. Mark curled his lip in contempt, not even glancing at the papers sliding toward his hand. I'm perfectly calm, I replied, slowly stepping closer to him and looking straight into his self-satisfied eyes, which still held no trace of fear, no hint of understanding that his familiar world had already been destroyed. Just a few months earlier, I had naively believed our marriage was a model of ideal American family happiness, built on mutual trust, shared goals, and years of support. Our large two-story mansion in an upscale suburb of New York always smelled of expensive bean coffee, fresh morning pastries, and the lily perfume Mark had given me for our 10th wedding anniversary. Every morning began with a long-established, almost sacred ritual. I brewed strong espresso, Mark read financial analysis in the Wall Street Journal on his new tablet, and outside the window our well-kept garden quietly rustled, the maintenance of which we never spared expense on. Together we built the development company Mark Build from nothing, when we had absolutely nothing except an old second-hand laptop, my modest savings from my youth, and an architecture degree I earned with honors from Columbia University. Mark had incredible business instincts, natural charm, and a talent for captivating demanding Manhattan investors at first glance, while I handled all the internal operations, overseeing design, personally checking every line of the budgets, and leading complex negotiations with material suppliers. The symbol of our triumph was a crystal model of our first major residential complex in Brooklyn, sitting on the mantelpiece in the living room. Mark affectionately called it the heart of our family business. We were not just spouses, we were a solid, unbreakable team storming the peaks of the American construction market, and no competitor could shake our position. At least, that's what I believed, until the fateful day when my 22-year-old niece Chloe appeared in our lives, arriving from a small town in Ohio supposedly to continue her studies at the prestigious Parsons School of Design. At first, Chloe's presence in our home seemed like a wonderful opportunity to show family care, to offer warmth I hadn't used up, and to help an orphan, since my older sister had passed away several years earlier after a long illness. The girl behaved surprisingly quietly, smiling shyly when we met, wearing simple knit dresses that drew no attention, and spending hours in her room on the 3rd floor diligently sketching for her school projects. I remember how, during family dinners, I would tenderly serve her homemade roast, while Mark, with a soft, patronizing smile, asked about her studies, carefully passing her the porcelain gravy boat. We're one family, Chloe. You should feel completely at home here. Don't deny yourself anything and don't worry about a thing. New York is tough, but you've got us, Mark would say, gently patting my hand, and his persistent care at the time felt to me like the highest expression of nobility and family unity. But over time, barely noticeable and increasingly disturbing signs began to appear in our cozy, measured home atmosphere. Signs that the perfect facade of our American dream had cracked. Chloe started coming down to breakfast more often in silk robes with a slightly too revealing neckline, while Mark suddenly began regularly staying late at construction sites in Queens, citing endless complaints from city departments. I stubbornly dismissed it all as simple fatigue, a midlife crisis that hits many men his age, and the excessive freedom of modern youth, refusing to see what was obvious. The first real, deafening warning signs came at the beginning of autumn, when the nights grew cold and the air filled with the scent of decaying leaves, damp ocean fog, and approaching change. Mark became pathologically secretive, withdrawn, and irritable. His brand-new expensive iPhone now always lay on the table face down, and he reacted to incoming notifications with strange, twitchy impatience. Several times I accidentally found him in his office late at night, hurriedly closing his laptop when I suddenly entered, frowning at the creak of the heavy door. "Mark, are there problems with investors in the new Long Island project? Why haven't you slept for 3 nights?" I once asked quietly, placing a cup of warm milk and honey in front of him. "Martha, for God's sake, stay out of my business." You've become too paranoid, suspicious, and intrusive lately. Go focus on your drawings instead, he snapped without looking at me, stubbornly staring out the dark window covered in rain. At that moment, for the first time, a sticky, cold sense of dread stirred inside me. A lump rose in my throat, and my ears rang at the sharp, completely unfamiliar tone of his voice, the kind I had never heard in 12 years of marriage. I tried to silence that persistent inner voice, telling myself he was simply overworked by a difficult financial deal that was supposed to close in a month. The tension in the house grew day by day, turning what had once been a safe and happy family nest into a minefield where every careless word or glance could trigger a massive explosion. Chloe began showing Mark a strange, almost openly familiar kind of attention. Adjusting his tie before he left for Manhattan, pouring his favorite bourbon while I was busy checking complex engineering drawings in the kitchen. Mark accepted these gestures with a condescending, pleased smile, while increasingly suggesting I visit expensive plastic surgeons on Fifth Avenue, casually remarking that the wrinkles around my eyes had become too noticeable and unattractive. You need to rest more and take better care of yourself, darling. You look too pale, tired, and dull next to our young guest, he drawled with poisonous sweetness during one of our Sunday barbecues in the backyard. At those words, Chloe only modestly lowered her eyes and smiled gently, carefully twirling salad on her fork, as if the comment had nothing to do with her. That was when I made my most fatal mistake, writing it off as my own foolish female jealousy, deciding I was simply envious of my niece's fleeting youth and imagining problems where none existed. It was then, on that quiet sunny afternoon, that I should have understood everything, when I noticed how their fingers accidentally brushed over the porcelain salt cellar, and how their eyes met in a silent understanding known only to them. The point of no return came on a rainy, damp Thursday, when Mark left for yet another emergency meeting with contractors, and Chloe went to her evening practical classes at Parsons. I urgently needed an old flash drive with archived architectural projects from our firm, which was usually kept in the bottom drawer of my husband's massive desk in his home office. I entered the room, bathed in the dull, even glow of a desk lamp, and approached the desk, feeling a strange, inexplicable tremor in my knees, as if I were committing some terrible crime in my own home. My fingers touched the cool metal handle of the drawer, pulled it smoothly toward me, and among neatly stacked piles of official contracts, I noticed an unfamiliar leather notebook with gold embossing. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it onto the carpet. Opening the very first page, I saw Chloe's neat, flowing handwriting, the same I had known since her earliest childhood. But this was far from the diary of a diligent student. It was a detailed, cynical account of her secret romantic encounters with my husband at a small luxury hotel in upstate New York. From a hidden pocket in the end paper slipped a stack of glossy photographs. In them, my Mark was gently holding Chloe by the waist, passionately kissing her on the lips against the backdrop of that same Porsche we had bought with the shared income of our company. Cold sweat instantly ran down my back, even though the office was stuffy from the climate system running at full power. Bile rose to my throat, hot, sharp, with a metallic taste of adrenaline and total collapse of illusions. For a second my vision darkened, and the sound of autumn rain striking the window turned into a distant, heavy roar that clogged my ears, as if I had been plunged deep underwater. Until the very last moment I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, whispering with terror-dry lips that it was some stupid prank, someone's cruel joke, an attempt to frame my honest and faithful husband. But when I turned the next page and found an enclosed official bank statement from Mark's hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands, the last illusions shattered with a deafening crack. From that account over the past 6 months, enormous sums had been regularly withdrawn to pay for luxury boutiques in Soho, the rent of a lavish Manhattan penthouse for Chloe, and, worst of all, a gradual, methodical siphoning of assets from our family construction company Mark Build. The damage amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and beneath each financial order was the clear, bold signature of my husband, who had been systematically robbing me behind my back while I worked myself to exhaustion. The realization of the true scale of betrayal crashed over me like a suffocating wave, squeezing my chest so tightly I physically couldn't take even a single short breath. For a moment I told myself it could still be explained, that Mark had simply become confused, a victim of a young and calculating manipulator who had skillfully exploited his male vanity and hormones. But then I flipped to the next page and saw a printout of their private messenger correspondence, where Mark called me an old burden, a lazy cow, and promised Chloe he would completely transfer the company into her name as soon as a major construction deal in Tribeca closed. That deal was set to close in exactly 3 weeks on Friday, and I had critically little time left to save my life, my pride, and the product of years of relentless work. I carefully placed all the photographs and statements back into the folder, feeling the keys in my hand digging into my skin in crescent shapes, though I no longer felt physical pain. My entire mind had pushed emotion aside. A ringing, icy rage filled my entire being, instantly drying my tears and forcing my brain to work with the precision of a Swiss clock preparing its counterstrike. The first open confrontation happened that very evening, when Mark returned home in an excellent mood, loudly humming some jazz tune and casually tossing his expensive coat onto a chair in the hallway. I was waiting for him in the living room, sitting in a deep armchair in front of the fireplace, where logs crackled cheerfully, creating a deceptive, eerie illusion of warmth and comfort. "Oh, Martha, you're still awake? Perfect. Have the staff prepare me a light dinner. I'm absolutely starving after those endless business meetings with partners in the city," he said with deliberate nonchalance as he walked toward the home bar. "Business meetings, you say? Do they now hold important construction tenders in small hotels upstate?" I asked in a calm, icy voice that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by several degrees. Mark froze instantly with a glass of whiskey in his hand. His broad back tensed, and his jaw clenched so hard his cheekbones whitened, betraying immediate, animal fear. A second later he recovered, slowly turned toward me, and curled his lips in contempt, choosing his usual, time-tested tactic of rough psychological pressure. "Were you snooping through my personal things again, Martha? How long are you going to keep throwing these ridiculous, baseless tantrums over your delusions and insecurities?" he growled, taking a wide step toward me and trying to tower over me with his massive frame to break my will. "It's perfectly normal for a man to want a young, fresh body." My husband laughed coldly, leaning back on the leather sofa where we once planned our future. How should I put it, past your prime? Look at yourself. You've turned into a dry, boring office rat. Someone you can't even have a decent conversation with anymore except about cement, bricks, and tax reports. "Well now, darling, you don't have to hide your close relationship with my niece anymore," I said with a faint smirk, placing a blue folder of divorce papers on the table. "Oh, stop this nonsense. You're not going anywhere because without me you're absolutely nothing, just a draftsman I pulled out of the mud and turned into someone in this city," he sneered, trying to regain control. "I'm calm," I said, stepping closer, looking at his face flushed with rage, and taking the folder back into my hands. "You thought you could take my company, my home, and my life by hiding behind concern for a relative? Adult business is over, Mark. Something real is beginning." A heavy, ringing, almost tangible silence filled the room. The kind of silence in which you can clearly hear the dull collapse of a 12-year shared life, turning to dust. Mark silently finished his whiskey in large gulps, never looking at me, and in that cowardly, rotten silence I read everything I needed to know about the man I had once truly loved and respected. At that moment, a sleepy Chloe came downstairs, wrapped in her soft pink silk robe, the one I had personally bought for her on Fifth Avenue at the start of the school year as a gesture of support. "What's going on? Why are you shouting so loudly in the middle of the night? You're keeping me awake. I have an important review tomorrow for my course," she said with feigned childlike innocence, shifting her calculating gaze between Mark and me. "What's going on, Chloe?" I said sharply. "Is that your generous sponsor has just signed his own final verdict?" The girl immediately went pale and took a frightened step back toward the stairs. Mark instantly changed tactics. His face smoothed out, and his voice took on those fake, syrupy sweet tones he usually used to pacify the most capricious and wealthy investors of our firm. "Martha, darling, come on, let's calm down, sit down and talk like grown, reasonable people. After all, we've gone through every imaginable hardship together over so many years," he sang softly, trying to take my hand with his slightly trembling palm. "It was just a fleeting flirtation, a stupid mistake, the devil tempted me, a momentary lapse in judgment. You yourself know perfectly well how much I value our marriage and your enormous contribution to our shared enterprise." For a second it seemed to me that there was a grain of sincere remorse in his words, that everything could still be resolved peacefully, without a public, dirty scandal, without courts, without involving outsiders. But then I remembered the account statements hidden in the blue folder, the transfers used to purchase a luxury penthouse for Chloe, and that false hope collapsed, leaving only a cold, calculated determination to see this through to the end. "Save your cheap fairy tales for the judges, Mark. Your tender care for the family was always just a strategic move to gain full access to my money and my talent. I hissed through clenched teeth, sharply pulling my hand out of his. In response, Mark instantly dropped the mask of remorse. His eyes narrowed into two thin slits, filled with wild, uncontrollable, animal-like rage and contempt. You ungrateful bitch. If you dare file for divorce and break the contracts, I'll grind you into dust through my lawyers, destroy your professional reputation, and you'll be left on the street with not a single cent in your pocket, he shouted furiously, hurling an empty heavy glass straight into the fireplace, where it shattered into thousands of tiny shards glittering in the flames. Chloe let out a frightened gasp, covering her mouth with her hands, but in her eyes I saw not fear for her uncle, but a selfish terror of losing the luxurious New York life she had so quickly and easily grown used to. Try it, I replied quietly, almost in a whisper. I turned and slowly walked toward the exit of the living room, head held high, feeling their hateful, burning stares on my back. I stepped outside, got into my SUV, and drove away from what had once been my home, knowing that the most difficult, exhausting, and important battle of my life lay ahead. I spent the night in a modest roadside motel on the outskirts of the highway. The coffee in a paper cup tasted like bitter ash in my mouth, but my hands no longer trembled, and in my soul there was a cold, surgical calm of a professional ready for a prolonged war. The next morning, exactly at 9 o'clock, I was already sitting in the strict, cool-lit office of a well-known New York divorce attorney, Mr. Arthur Blackwood, in Manhattan. The elderly, experienced lawyer in an immaculate gray suit carefully studied my documents line by line, methodically adjusting his horn-rimmed glasses and occasionally shaking his gray head. Your husband made the classic, fatal mistake of all overconfident men, Mrs. Martha. He considered you a weak, dependent woman incapable of a systematic, prepared response, the attorney said with a dry, approving smile. All the financial schemes involving transfers to your niece's accounts are perfectly documented. We will freeze his personal assets through the county court before the main proceedings even begin. We have exactly 2 weeks before the official closing of the Tribeca deal, Mr. Blackwood. Mark plans to transfer the final investor tranche into his personal account, I reminded him, nervously drumming my fingers on the leather armrest of the deep chair. Don't worry. We will trigger a legal domino effect that will strip him of even the slightest ability to take a single unlawful step outside the law, the lawyer assured me confidently, signing the official power of attorney. An exhausting, quiet, and externally invisible interim week began. Collecting additional evidence, covert audits, and endless draining consultations with independent accountants reviewing every Mark-billed account. I temporarily moved into a small rented apartment in Brooklyn, where my morning ritual now consisted of a cup of strong black tea, without sugar and long, careful examination of bank transfers on my laptop screen. Mark tried calling me several times, first hurling furious threats, promising to cut off my access within the construction association, then abruptly switching tones and begging for forgiveness, sending enormous bouquets of my once favorite white lilies through couriers. I deliberately did not answer his calls, simply and coldly blocking new numbers, feeling how each day the old emotional pain gave way to a clean, concentrated energy for building my new independent reality. The symbol of my past remained that crystal model house on the fireplace shelf, which I had never taken from the living room. It now seemed not like the heart of a successful company, but like a fragile glass trap in which I had voluntarily locked myself for 12 long years in exchange for the illusion of happiness. The night before the final confrontation, I barely slept, waiting for dawn by the window with a cooled cup of tea in my hands, watching the first rays of blinding morning sun struggle through the famous New York skyline. Inside me, that final internal click finally happened. The one that forever turns a frightened, betrayed victim into a ruthless, calculated fighter who already knows every step of her enemy in advance. I looked at myself in the mirror. A pale, composed face, dark hair tightly pulled into a strict bun, the cold, empty gaze of a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose except her long-awaited freedom. My plan was fully ready, all legal traps set with millimeter precision and loyal allies informed, waiting only for my final signal to deliver a crushing strike. You thought, Mark, that a young and pliable body matters more than a sharp mind, experience, and iron will? Today you will feel on your own skin how badly you miscalculated your simple male arithmetic, I whispered to my reflection, decisively applying bright, blood-red lipstick. The decisive, dramatic scene unfolded in the main conference room of our New York office, with panoramic views of Central Park, where all key investors, attorneys, and board members had gathered for the formal signing of the Tribeca contract. Mark sat at the head of the long polished table, leaning back confidently and signing the glossy pages of the agreement with his expensive gold Parker pen. Chloe sat slightly behind him in a guest chair, wearing a provocatively expensive designer dress bought with my money, chin raised proudly, casting triumphant, contemptuous glances at those present. So, gentlemen, all formalities are finally completed. The final transfer of $5 million can be sent to the account specified in the official appendix, Mark announced loudly and ceremoniously, flashing his practiced Hollywood smile. The guests murmured approvingly, shuffling important papers, preparing to finalize the successful closing of the largest deal of the construction season. At that very moment, the massive glass door of the boardroom slowly opened with an ominous hiss, and I stepped inside confidently, accompanied by Mr. Blackwood and 2 stern court officials of the state in uniform. Everyone present froze instantly. A deathly, chilling silence filled the room, broken only by the dull, steady sound of my high heels on the expensive parquet floor. Mark literally jumped to his feet. His face flushed deep red, and the gold pen slipped from his suddenly sweaty fingers, rolling across the table. "Martha, what the hell are you doing here?" Security, immediately remove this insane, unstable woman from the building. She has no connection to today's deal, he shouted wildly, trying to shield the financial documents on the table with his broad body. "You're wrong, Mark. I have the most direct legal connection to this company. 50% of all shares still belong to me by right, and without my signature, that document is nothing but trash," I replied in a steady, icy voice, stopping at the opposite end of the table. Mr. Blackwood stepped forward in silence with professional dignity and placed a thick folder on the table in front of the lead investor. It was bound with the official embossed seal of the New York State Court. "Gentlemen, I am obliged to formally halt your signing process. This is a court order for the full freezing of all personal and corporate accounts belonging to Mr. Mark, in connection with formal charges of large-scale fraud, asset diversion, and forgery of a co-owner's signatures," the attorney declared loudly and clearly across the entire room. The lead investor, an elderly Manhattan billionaire with a stern, aristocratic face, carefully read the first page, frowned, and pushed the signed contract away from him with a gesture of disgust. "Mr. Mark, explain to everyone present what this means. Were you knowingly trying to involve us in a criminal scheme involving court-frozen assets?" the investor asked in a cold, authoritative tone, drilling his devastating gray gaze into my husband. Mark turned pale so quickly it looked as if all the blood had been drained from his body in a single second. His knees gave way, and he sank heavily back into his leather chair, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the shore. "This is an outrageous lie. This is all dirty, premeditated revenge from a bitter, aging wife who's simply jealous of my new young partner and is trying to destroy the contract of my life," Mark screamed hysterically, pointing a trembling finger at Chloe, who shrank fearfully into the corner. "Martha, you won't dare destroy the company we built together for so many years. You'll be left with nothing. You're destroying your own future. This apartment and this company were bought with my money and built with my mind, Mark. And your niece was bought with your own stupidity and vanity. I cut off your access to the accounts last night through a court order. You're empty. Your card shows an absolute zero balance," I said quietly, but the words landed like a gunshot at point-blank range, placing a heavy and irreversible period on his career. Hearing about the zero balance, Chloe suddenly jumped up, rushed to Mark, roughly snatched his phone out of his hands, and tried to check the banking app. But the screen stubbornly displayed a system notification. All accounts had been frozen by Chase Bank. "Mark, tell me this isn't true. Where's my money for the penthouse lease? Where's the extra payment for the new car you promised me?" she shrieked, completely losing the last traces of her affected New York sophistication, shaking him with genuine, savage fury. Mark didn't even answer her. He sat there, staring blankly at the polished table surface, where a crystal model of our first Brooklyn home had been placed, brought in by staff as decoration for the boardroom. Court bailiffs approached him, politely but firmly asking him to vacate the premises and accompany them to complete the paperwork for the fraud and signature forgery case. The legal, financial, and social consequences for my former husband were truly crushing and irreversible. All American investors severed ties with him that same day, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings, and the press quickly blew the scandal into a massive story in New York's construction sector, destroying his reputation down to the foundation. The The contrast of retribution worked flawlessly and like for like. The man who had once tried to coldly throw me out onto the street with nothing ended up a homeless bankrupt, forced to live in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Queens. Chloe, of course, left him the same day she fully realized her rich benefactor could no longer pay for her whims, and she quietly returned to Ohio, never finishing Parsons and ending up with nothing. 8 long months passed since that loud scandal in the Manhattan boardroom, and New York was already breathing the warm, blooming air of May, filled with the sense of Central Park greenery and new life. I sat on the open veranda of my new small but incredibly stylish townhouse in Brooklyn, purchased with my legally awarded share from the division of our former joint development empire. Our old firm, Mark Build, ceased to exist, but from its ashes I created my own architectural firm, Martha Design, which had already secured 2 major contracts from city authorities for designing modern cultural centers. My mornings once again began with aromatic coffee, but this ritual was no longer shadowed by deceit, hidden phone calls, lies, or poisonous remarks about my fading youth. I felt strong, free, and truly alive. Like an American woman who had finally dropped a massive granite boulder she had been carrying for years in pursuit of false ideals. Last night, Mark unexpectedly called my private number. His voice on the line sounded dull and cracked, with none of his former arrogance, confidence, or contempt for others. He hesitated for a long time, coughed into the receiver, and then hoarsely asked to borrow a small amount of money, complaining about poor health, overwhelming lawsuits from the IRS, and a crushing loneliness in a foreign city. Martha, forgive me if you can. I was a complete, utter fool. I only now realize you were the only person who truly loved me for who I was, not for my money or status in New York, he muttered miserably, sniffling on the other end of the line. Business is over, Mark. In this life, everyone pays their own bills, on their own, without help. I replied calmly and firmly ended the call, feeling neither anger nor pity, only a faint, almost imperceptible emptiness. I looked at my new desk, where instead of the large fake crystal model, there was now a simple, elegant vase with a branch of blooming apple blossoms that I had cut from my own yard. The silence in my home no longer frightened me at all. It had become mine, filled with peace, and this newfound freedom was truly priceless, incomparable to anything from the past. Looking at the delicate apple petals, I realized that my entire former life had been nothing more than a long, drawn-out preparation for this moment of true independence and self-awareness. Did I feel sorry for the lost years? Perhaps just a little, but the experience gained and the icy clarity of mind were worth every tear shed into a pillow and every moment of doubt. My new team at the firm consisted of young, talented, and dedicated New York architects who looked at me with genuine respect, valuing my professionalism rather than my ability to cater to an arrogant man's ego. I opened my laptop to sketch the first designs for a new residential complex in Williamsburg, and noticed that my fingers moved across the keyboard with a newfound lightness and creative confidence. No one stood behind me anymore, criticizing my bold ideas or trying to claim my intellectual work as their own. Sometimes, driving through New York past the buildings we once constructed together, I no longer felt a sting of resentment or longing for the destroyed family home. Those high-rise brick and glass structures now seemed like monuments to my former naivety, milestones on the path to the person I had ultimately become in spite of everything. The metropolis lived its restless, endless life. Faces changed, ambitious unions were born and died, and I stood firmly on my own feet, knowing my foundation was now built to last. In the evening, as the sun slowly set over the Hudson, painting the skyscrapers in incredible shades of crimson and gold, I stepped onto the veranda to breathe in the cool air filled with freedom. My phone vibrated softly in the pocket of my tailored jacket. It was a call from a major developer who wanted to discuss expanding our contract and offering me leadership of a new major project in the very heart of Manhattan. Yes, I'm listening. I'm ready to begin discussions at any time, I replied with a soft, confident smile, feeling the warm spring wind gently touch my hair. The keys to new doors lay on the hallway table, light, cool, and ringing with genuine freedom that no one would ever be able to take away from me again.